Welcome to Psychedelics, Past, Present, Future, a lecture series co-organized by the Center for Access to Information and Justice at the University of Winnipeg and the Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dalhousie University. We're featuring speakers researching psychedelics, drugs, and consciousness-altering practices. Psychedelics and plant medicines have many justice implications, but touch on philosophy and history, chemistry and ecology, indigenous knowledge and relations too. I acknowledge we are situated on ancestral indigenous lands on Treaty 1 territory here. I acknowledge this territory is also the heartland of the Métis people, and as a settler, I acknowledge that Winnipeg's water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. We're organizing these talks because the drug war is oppressive. Some people find healing in psychedelics and other substances. Some people want to investigate consciousness, explore the infinite present, and some people are passionate about their relations with plant teachers. Thanks to the University of Winnipeg event team and media team for working with us. Here's the format. Our speaker is going to speak for 25, 30 minutes. We'll have some questions, and you in the audience, you can ask questions too. Just pop your questions into the Q&A tab there. Now, let me introduce two very important people. First, our co-host, Dr. Agnieszka Dole, is postdoctoral fellow at the faculties of Law and Medicine, Dalhousie University, and a member of the Health Law Institute and Technoscience and Regulation Research Unit at Dal. Agnieszka works at the intersections of law, medicine, and society, and her current ethnographic project is on the regulation of psychedelics in Canada. And today's speaker, Dr. Tehseen Nooranit, is an anthropologist interested in the phenomenological and epistemic character of extreme experiences and how these are understood through science and politics. He's completing a monograph tracing the renewed scientific and therapeutic interest in psychedelic experiences in the global north, exploring implications for theories of psychopathology and approaches to mental health care. Tehseen conducted qualitative research with the Johns Hopkins Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit from 2013-2015. He's published for a range of audiences in numerous journals on the topics of experiential knowledge, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, including recent articles on the politics and paradoxes of psychedelic medicalization and digital psychedelia. Tehseen, thanks for being here. The floor is yours for your presentation.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Kevin, and Agnieszka, for the invitation. It's really an honor to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A already and to hearing from you all. And so forgive me for first talking at you for a little while. I was told 30 to 40 minutes was about right. And so I think the talk is about 35 minutes. So apologies if that's a little bit long, but that's what I've kind of gone for. I'm sort of reading actually the first draft of a new chapter of my book. So yeah, I'll share my screen and get going. So I hope you can all see this. Could you let me know if you can see it okay?
Yeah, I can see it.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay. So the title is Psychedelics, Madness, and Dialectics of the Will. So I'll jump right in. Oops. Any comparison of the phenomenology of psychedelic and psychotic or mad experience immediately runs into difficulties. What is the kernel of the psychedelic experience? What is at the core of madness? Examples will quickly bring home the heterogeneity of both sets of experiences and contestation over what comes under the labels, or indeed the appropriateness of the labels themselves. One place to seek refuge is in the neuroscience. For example, in looking at the psychotomimetic or model psychosis theory through the influence of psychedelic drugs on the activity of certain brain networks. In recent years, for example, psychedelic researchers have enthusiastically characterized the default mode network, or DMN, as the seat of the ego, while the DMN has long been an area of interest for psychopathology researchers interested in schizophrenia. For social scientists who are less enamored of this as a solution, we might begin by considering how the psychedelic experience has been endlessly recharacterized by aficionados, advocates, and other interested parties since it first became an object of the gaze of Western science. By the end of the so-called first wave of psychedelic research in the 1960s, psychedelic substances were understood to produce a variety of kinds of experience. Sometimes these were hierarchically arranged, as with Masters and Houston's 1967 classic description of the 4 stages of the psychedelic experience: the sensory stage, the recollective analytic stage, the symbolic stage, and the integral, or we might say mystical or non-dual stage. In today's revival of interest in psychedelic experiences, there's been a growing drive to map out the experiential terrain. One way to identify some of its historic and contemporary characterizations is via the names the substances have been given. The term being used here, psychedelic, was coined by Humphrey Osmond in 1956 in your neighboring state of Saskatchewan as a way to get away from connotations of madness, but we might consider so many others, including hallucinogens, psychotomimetics, deliriants, delusionogens, eidetics, misperceptinogens, mysticomimetics, phanerothymes, phantastica, entheogens, intactogens, empathogens, ecodelics, egolytics, arcadelics, epilogens, psychoplastogens, as entropy increasing substances, as inherently queering substances, and as meaning making substances. And looping effects with how these names are understood and taken up and shape subjectivities are not only an additional consideration suggestive of what Ian Hacking has called dynamic nominalism, but potentially drive the very process of label proliferation, perhaps through desires to script experiences not yet had, ontologically bootstrapping new kinds of experiences into being. In terms of today's coalescing research, public debates, technological and legal innovations, and an emerging industry and set of professions, the once neologism psychedelic continues to do work, drawing boundaries around what should and should not be connected. Amidst these efforts to distill the psychedelic experience, many attempts have been made to connect it with madness. One is through the aura of strangeness and bafflement that surrounds these experiences. Another concerns the mystical tropes found across both sets of experiences, in particular ineffability, alterations in space and time, paradoxicality, and noesis, or the kind of authoritative character of experiences. Another is to see these as experiences of excess and similar in that respect to the study of sexual experience. Both can be viewed as profusions of sensations, thoughts, perceptions of interior images, and so on, which can be explained in terms of the opening of the reducing valve of the brain articulated by Aldous Huxley, and extending the subtractive metaphor of consciousness proposed by Henri Bergson. A connected idea is that both psychedelic experiences and madness entail the non-specific amplification of awareness. And we can see how these ideas might play out in relation to some of the neologisms on this slide. So these are some things for us to consider. These are some similarities for us to consider. Yet the psychotomimetic theory of psychedelics is largely dismissed today, understood to be repudiated within mainstream research with psychedelics. The distinction between willed and unwilled experiences plays a crucial role. Historically, willing the experience versus being passively subjected to it maps onto the psychedelic and psychotic experience respectively, and has been offered as a clear mark of their distinction. Once a chief advocate of the psychotomimetic theory of psychedelics and a key figure in the search for the psychedelic analog autotoxin responsible for schizophrenia in the 1950s, Humphrey Osmond had turned away from the idea that psychedelics mimicked psychosis by the 1970s. In between these time periods, anti-psychiatry movements had gained popular appeal in Europe and North America. R.D. Laing's hugely influential book, Conceiving Madness as a Journey, The Politics of Experience, was published in 1967. In their 1969 review of the politics of experience for the the British Journal of Psychiatry, Osmond, with Harriet Mann and lead author Miriam Siegler, articulated a definitive break between psychedelic and mad experiences. They wrote, perhaps the most important point to be made about Laing's psychedelic model is its implication that schizophrenics, this is the language that was used at the time, will benefit from being seen as persons embarked on a voyage of self-discovery. It would be closer to the truth to see most of them as voyagers who have been shanghaied for unknown reasons onto a ship which never reaches port. Psychedelic voyages are usually voluntary, and the person usually knows what the agent of his changed perception is. Schizophrenia is involuntary. The person rarely knows the cause of his strange new perceptions, and he is unlikely to receive much helpful information about it. Here we see how key to the claim that psychedelic and psychotic experiences are dissimilar has been the idea that the former are by and large willed, intentional, and valued experiences of clear origin, while the latter assail the self, unexpected, unwanted, and unexplained. In the time I have left, I would like to focus on one aspect of this distinction, the opposition between willed psychedelic and unwilled psychotic experiences. A guiding intuition that I've learned from reading Mariana Valverde's excellent book on alcohol, Diseases of the Will, is that the will is more complex than simply something that is present or absent. It can be deployed against itself, as in when willing becomes an unflappable habit, one we can no longer trust to be operating in our best interest. The will, moreover, can become the very site of our own governance. How is the will characterized through psychedelic clinical therapeutics? In the first article of the current wave of research on safety protocols in running clinical studies with psychedelics in 2008, authored by the Johns Hopkins research team, they write, the volunteer is encouraged to mentally surrender to the experience, trusting that her or his usual state of consciousness will return when the drug effects resolve. For example, if the participant experiences disturbing internal imagery of a demon or monster, he or she is encouraged to mentally approach the figure and interact with it, e.g., imagine asking the figure why it has appeared, rather than attempt to flee from the disturbing imagery. The participant should be alerted that sometimes people experience extremely convincing sensations of dissolving, melting, exploding, and so forth, and that the best way to deal with all such situations is to surrender to the experience, subjectively allowing oneself to dissolve, melt, or explode. Similar advice applies to physical symptoms such as nausea. For example, participants may be encouraged to dive into their stomachs, which may alleviate the nausea, as it has been suggested anecdotally that nausea and other somatic discomforts may in part be of a psychosomatic nature. In a striking analogy offered in his 2015 book, reflecting on his storied involvement in psychedelic therapy spanning 6 decades, Hopkins' lead clinician, Bill Richards, writes, sorry, there's a bit of a delay with my computer. In the Middle Ages, monks may have learned to deal with demons by looking them straight in the eye and holding an elevated cross between themselves and their visions. Similarly, in navigating through the alternative states of consciousness facilitated by entheogens, the intent to confront any visionary manifestation that appears threatening has proved to be of fundamental importance in avoiding panic and in facilitating insight and the resolution of conflicts. Thus, should one encounter a visionary demon, dragon, monster, or boogeyman, one, if well prepared, will steadily and intentionally move towards the manifestation with eye contact if possible, essentially saying, hello, are you ever scary? Why are you here? What are you made of? What might I learn from you? This is one of those points in a session where the volunteer might reach out for support and interpersonal grounding by holding the hand of a guide or another human being. Reliably, when this occurs, the image discloses its meaning, which sometimes may trigger screams or tears, often followed by laughter and deep relaxation. The monster sometimes becomes recognized as the abusive babysitter or the angry alcoholic father, as an expression of one's own shameful past behavior, or even as a symbolic manifestation of some particular fear that one has been avoiding. What is so important here is the discovery that the monster has meaning and in itself is an invitation to enhance psychological health and spiritual maturation. Its purpose is not to torment, but to teach. That bears repeating. Its purpose is not to torment, but to teach. It's worth noting that in the same chapter, Richards approvingly cites the Soteria House respite model, which emerged out of Langian anti-psychiatry ideas as requiring staff who requiring staff who emphasize, quote, trust, respect, and interpersonal grounding, end of quote. And then fast forward another 5 years, and an influential therapeutic model that was lead authored by Ros Watts at Imperial College London, and uses an ACE acronym, accept, connect, embody, includes the following instructions for the preparation ahead of a psychedelic therapy session. Okay. Imagine you are diving down into the warm water. You are completely safe. As you dive down, the water surrounds you and holds you. You can breathe so easily, and you feel held, supported, and warm as you swim down deeper and deeper. Currents pull you in this way and that way. You just trust and let go, and you swim deeper down. You're on a journey. You are carried by the current, and you don't have to decide where to go. Just let yourself be carried. With each moment, you surrender yourself more and more. You let go and allow yourself to glide along wherever this journey will take you, up, down, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always knowing that you are safe. Let yourself surge down with force and purpose. You are swimming deep into yourself, exploring parts of yourself that you have never explored before, and you can trust that you will be shown all that you need to see, that you will feel all that you need to feel, without you needing to control anything or rationalize it or make sense of it. All you need to do is trust, let go, and be open to these waters. See what you might find. Interviews I've conducted with psychedelic researchers reveal an emphasis on bringing curiosity to the experience, with the working assumption that nothing encountered in the mind can be harmful, so to explore it, get to know it. I've become curious about the curiosity and trust called forth in these modalities. I'd like to note 4 things. First, with the methodological challenge of how to blind trials involving strong psychedelic experiences becoming of increasing concern, placebo effects are suspected of doing a lot of the work of healing through psychedelic-assisted therapies. Here, I think there's an opportunity to look into hesitation, doubt, and uncertainty as potential healing mechanisms in psychedelic therapy that have not been sufficiently considered. And that's something I'm happy to talk about a bit more afterwards. Second, let us note how curiosity is also a virtue of science itself, epitomized by memes of Einstein urging us to be nothing if not passionately curious. The cultures of psychedelic research that host psychedelic science, the cultures of scientific research that host psychedelic science research are no exception. And thus, the scientists might reasonably think, why would it not also be at the root of successful psychedelic therapy? Thirdly, these texts suggest a stance of curiosity towards the psychedelic experience can lead, at its apotheosis, to a surrendering to that experience, a being taken away by it, or an absorption into it. And lastly, how in emerging psychedelic therapeutic discourses, there is a close relationship between the curiosity with which volunteer participants and clients are encouraged to enter the psychedelic experience and the value of integration experiences afterwards, designed to take the fruits of the experience forward into everyday life. The standard articulation of this is that the efficacy of the therapy is determined in part by the curiosity and openness that the person has towards their experiences. And then integration practices will help retain for longer or even magnify those therapeutic effects. We find emphasis on trust and curiosity in the therapeutics of the psychiatric survivor and mad pride movements too, to learn to cultivate ways of being in the world as dangerous gifts, to use the language of the Icarus Project. For instance, in the Hearing Voices movement, hearing voices that others cannot hear and other unusual experiences elsewhere pathologized as psychotic are considered meaningful, bearers of important messages for the voice hearer. To tranquilize or ignore the voices is to shoot the proverbial messenger. Instead, the point is to be curious about the experiences in order to better understand what and even who they are and what their purpose is. I find something very courageous and bold in the claim, rapidly being normalized in psychedelic therapy doxa, that nothing in the mind can hurt us. That boldness enables a clear therapeutic programmatic to enter into and stay with whatever experiences come up, as well as the idea that one may not encounter what one wants to hear, but will encounter what one needs to hear. At the same time, this kind of demarcation of the space of the mind from the world itself, where clearly much can and does harm us, leaves itself open to critiques that argue for the porosity of the mind, the entanglement of mind and world, the world as collective mind, or even how the overwhelming forces of the world are mirrored by overwhelming forces in the mind. In the case of Bill Richard's demons, these could be characterized as metaphorical narrativizations of emotionally charged and ethically challenging image forms or phantasmata, whether remembered or conjured in the imagination. But this leaves open the question of whether there are forces that are capable of penetrating human minds and causing harm. Okay, I'm sorry, that didn't come up, I think. I hope you're following what I'm following with the slides, but I'll continue. Okay. I want to park these questions here to consider instead how curiosity towards and trust in experience, celebrated as the cornerstones of the practices of willing, cultivated and overground psychedelic therapy today, can also be the way of madness. This may not be surprising if we take a longer historical perspective. For instance, in his study of curiosity as a virtue in science, John Agar documents how prior to the Restoration, so prior to the sort of mid-17th century, curiosity was a much more mixed bag, quote, the source of truth and error, the sign of a free intellect, and the stigma of corruption, end of quote. In 2016, the Reverend Rita Powell, Episcopal chaplain at Harvard University and a participant in New York University's research trial giving the psychedelic psilocybin to religious professionals, explained that she turned down the chance to have a second session because she had gone to the limit of the human being, and so why would she have another session? I've heard this kind of point being made a lot amongst psychedelic research participants. How might we understand the reluctance to have more of these powerful and profound experiences in settings of love and care? It reminds me of Alan Watts' famous quip, "When you get the message, hang up the phone." Certainly there's something about the arduousness of these experiences, but I wonder whether these kinds of missives also allude to other dangers that lurk. In his impressive work, Madness and Modernism, published in 1992, Louis Sass characterizes schizophrenic experience as an excess of self-awareness and reflexivity, what he calls hyper-reflexivity, spirals of awareness that alienate the person from their body and emotions in ways Sass shows are uncannily reminiscent of modern art. Sass's rendering of the experiences of those diagnosed with schizophrenia is already psychedelic, insofar as the experience reifies and makes available for reasoning and reflection an amplification of whatever was already there. Sass has been deeply influential in the area of phenomenological psychopathology, but the latter has been increasingly sidelined in psychiatry since the 1980s in favor of straightforward indicators and symptom checklists. One point which he has returned to many times in and since Madness and Modernism is whether madness ought to be considered an act or an affliction, insisting that this is in reality ambiguous. For Sass, so-called schizophrenic symptoms, quote, occupy an anxious twilight zone somewhere between act and affliction, end of quote. And the act-affliction dichotomy relies on a kind of, quote, Stone Age metaphysics, end of quote, whose adequacy dissipates once one looks at actual cases. Take the descriptions of increased withdrawal in schizophrenia. Sass suggests that a distinction between the ontic and the ontological would be useful, for the subject may have withdrawn from the ontic, specific entities that have been important to the person and drawn emotional significance for them beforehand, but not from the ontological totality of the world. On the contrary, in relation to the latter, Sass suggests there could be generalized affects that have actually increased, such as awe over or anxiety about everything disappearing. And yet such deeper engagement beyond that which is socially acceptable alienates others, leading the experiencer to close down in response to environmental hostility, effectively co-producing withdrawal in conversation with an intolerant world. Sass's notion of hyper-reflexivity as a central condition, exemplary of both modernist art and schizophrenia, is similar to Edward Podvol's claim that the mind's, what he calls the mind's micro-operations, are the seeds from which, quote, the different phenomena of madness can wildly germinate, end of quote. An analysis that Podvol develops through consideration of the French artist and psychonaut Henri Michaud's protracted experimentation with the psychedelic drug mescaline. In more recent qualitative research on psychosis onset and development, Nev Jones and colleagues described how, quote, doubts and skepticism were an integrated part of, rather than absent from, most participants' descriptions of the elaboration process, end of quote. Again, rather than being merely afflicted by their experiences were willed to the point where a key theme the authors found was participants subsequently feeling shame about their role in the making of their madness. I want to offer some excerpts to help think about the dialectics of willing in relation to extreme experiences. First, in this excerpt from Camilla in the Jones et al. Article, we see the importance of the relational and in particular the ancestral in such a making of madness. When I was 17, I became a lot more interested in schizophrenia and psychosis. And then I found out that my father had extreme psychosis when he was around the same age. From the literature I was reading, I got this idea that I'd be able to understand his experiences a lot better if I actually made myself psychotic. Second, in a conference I co-organized earlier this year entitled Psychedelics, Madness and Awakening, prominent US mental health advocate and social worker Ron Unger described the pursuit of his madness as a revolutionary Langian journey out of the oppressive environment he had found himself in when young, and that the spark of that revolution was an LSD experience. During that, he said, during that trip, I encountered some beings that let me know that things and experiences didn't have to mean what they had come to mean for me. And if I wanted, I could develop a completely different sense of myself and of the world. Now, a lot of people go through psychedelic trips and then they come down and say, oh, wasn't that fun? But it might not change them that much. But for me, I made it my goal to reorganize my life around the discoveries I'd made on that trip. I do find it interesting that a key theme in psychosis is the loss of a sense of self and the loss of contact with a previous sense of reality. But my sense at the time was of desperately wanting to get rid of my previous sense of self and to get rid of my previous sense of reality because they'd been so oppressive. Reflecting on his experience, Unger suggested that cultural scripts framing extreme experiences as illnesses to be passively subjected to rather than something to actively will can end up being self-fulfilling prophecies. Other conversations at our conference focused more on structures of colonialism, patriarchy, and sanism. For a third example, in the Q&A of a panel entitled Histories and Legacies, Imani Robinson suggested one difference between psychedelic and mad experiences being how they are differently positioned in relation to consent. Quote, As somebody who is at risk of police violence all the time in my communities, it feels as though there's some uneasiness in thinking about psychosis versus psychedelic experiences, as if we can make them the same or think about them or respond to them in the same way. And I think that some of that is about consent, about the very real difference of being diagnosed as psychotic versus consensually exploring psychedelic experiences. This idea of wanting to explore versus being violently responded to. End of quote. Of course, psychedelic drugs have not always been administered with consent, and here there is perhaps scope for the concept of informed consent to do work in relation to both sets of extreme experiences. As a fourth example, Jones et al. Offer the desire for clarity or certainty in experience as another motor of madness. Quote, wanting it to be one thing or the other, clearly madness and outside my control, or clearly not madness. It's hard to tell what was going on psychologically, but I kind of felt like, did I kind of just in order for a sense of closure and certainty, try to push myself over the edge? It's from Penelope. We can contrast this with the explicit permission to dwell in the uncertainty given in many psychedelic integration practices. Fifth and finally, and unsurprisingly, in a context of rapid psychedelic medicalization, there has been a clear therapeutic injunction to recuperate all experiences, growing out of the assertion that there is no such thing as a bad trip, but rather only challenging experiences that can be made good, insightful, and or productive. Consider how this cultural norm could fuel the reification dynamics found in Jones et al.'s study when they write. The delusions were like a puzzle or a game, said another, that I had to break down. For many participants, it was this active process of interpretation and naming that led particular symptoms to take on clearer and more enduring forms and meanings. One rendering of madness is in terms of the deep solitude of the new world one has entered, or is it constructed. Psychopathology has long wrestled with the relationship between religious and pathological thinking through the premise that the delusional, quote unquote, exists where reality is not shared. What then happens when two come to share in each other's experiential worlds? In the language psychedelic researcher come community elder, the late Ralph Metzner was fond of using when discussing first-person science, subjective plus one equals objective. The implications of this for those who share a break with consensus reality with the consensus reality that surrounds them is that when another appears, and here I think the term awakening is useful, all have a new possibility for companionship and therein the transformation of their experiences of so-called madness into something else. This then invites a different reading of the relationship between the intentional stance of those in psychedelic states and the value of integration practices. Experiences that are at their heart ambiguous, these experiences then become properly psychedelic through their sharing, being witnessed and explored afresh. Ontologically speaking, the experiences increase possibilities for connection, beginning with, and perhaps most crucially with, the guides or therapists who accompany people through their altered state experiences. Integration practices on this reading are less an affect modifier and more alchemical, transforming the quality of the experience and not simply the quantity or degree of the therapeutic effect. A lot is at stake in challenges to the reality of this other world, because they threaten to undermine the liberatory possibility of us stepping through the looking glass and finding each other at any time. The immediate and relatively seamless drawing of the curtains of the other world, whether in the onset of madness or in taking psychedelic drugs, or perhaps yet other kinds of extreme experiences, suggests it is right next to this one. However, the radical potential of escape and possibility contained in the cries of "it's right here" is undermined if that world is assumed to be an illusion born of the noetic quality of the experience. Much therefore rests on how real we take these worlds to be. If it is the case that those who haven't been there won't be convinced, then what scope is there really to derive political or social projects from these experiences? This adds to the liberatory potential of psychedelic experiences under a psychotomimetic framework, enabling a fuller understanding of not just the nature, but the political value of madness. Hopefully, I've shown how one point reinforced across psychedelic and mad sites is that the goal is not to turn all afflictions into acts. One is not better than the other. Emerging psychedelic therapeutics calls for curiosity, observation, and attention, as well as acceptance, unconditional trust, and participation in or into a bigger union. Trust and curiosity are used somewhat interchangeably in the psychedelic space. One commonly hears both trust, let go, be open, but also to be curious, or in a more Jungian mode, to, quote, treat the shadow with curiosity, not fear. Yet perhaps there is value in essentializing trust and curiosity just enough in order to tease them apart. For instance, while curiosity is over or about an other, trust might be considered as more relational, an encounter with an agential other, whether that other is a person or an experience. While curiosity guides inquiry, trust can be called forth where the will itself is broken, as in the appeal to a higher power in Alcoholics Anonymous. It is then tantamount to surrender, accepting, embracing, and diving into the experience, or indeed the frightful elements of it. Renowned Canadian psychedelic guide Andrew Feldmar, who was taught and supervised in LSD therapy by Lang in London in the 1970s, calls on us to embrace the dictum of psychoanalyst Marion Milner. Quote, "The only proper function of the will is to will, not to will. Visualize the will as a snake and make it bite its own tail." By refusing surrender, as one can easily do when pathologizing addiction or affliction, it is easy to conflate a willful trust and curiosity as equivalent virtues in the emerging ethico-politics of psychedelia. But when trust becomes surrender, we move from the active to the passive. Is this still willing? Bill Richards writes in his book, "The bottom line with a well-prepared person is to trust one's own mind, one's grounding with the guide beside him or her, the safety of the physical surroundings, and, if religious perspectives permit, God or another sacred symbol for ultimate reality. In this context, there really is nothing to fear." It is easy to question such a strong statement, especially given our examples of how trusting in one's experience can drive the loops and spirals of madness. Instead, I think this is fruitfully read as how trust in the clinical administration of psychedelics today conjoins A, the care of the therapist guides, B, the concern of the whole study team, C, the space as a safe container, and D, wider commitments, all of which coincide with the psychedelic journey. The whole network is bathed in trust. It is in this context that the will can be made to eat its own tail. We might contrast this with those who trust in their extreme experiences while not trusting the mental health system into which they have been placed, or indeed picking up on the lack of trust or even fear of themselves that that system has. I've centered the bold remarks to be curious about and or trust the contents of psychedelic experiences operationalized in clinical psychedelic therapeutics to consider ways that the psychotomimetic model helps to identify possibilities for overwhelm through negative feedback loops. My interest is less in understanding these processes as revealing the mind as other to itself, or as entangled with a wider world which has the capacity to overpower, but rather in how such feedback loops can themselves be willed, products of curiosity and trust gone awry. And that's the end of the talk. I hope that's okay time-wise as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for your talk. Can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah. Hi.
Yeah. Yeah. I have some questions. Agnieszka has some questions. Agnieszka, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first? And again, if you're in the audience, make sure to pop your question into the Q&A tab there.
You can go first if you want to.
Okay. I really like the way, Tehseen, you work as an anthropologist, but you work in a really theoretically informed way. And I know we have a couple of graduate students who are listening. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you approach your research. How do you think about incorporating theory? It seems like comparative ethnography or comparative case studies are really central to a lot of your works, and even today's work comparing two kind of experiences. So could you say a little bit about how you use theory and then how you design these studies you've undertaken in the last half decade?
Sure, yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's so nice. It's so nice to get the like reflective questions, you know, you sort of think back on your own praxis or your own method or whatever. Well, you know, I trained in philosophy and psychology a while ago, and then sort of moved through a bunch of different disciplines. But I think now I often find that the best kind of theorizing comes from kind of ethnographic concreteness, you know, detail, and there it's easy to overgeneralize when with just one example or story or anecdote, and so the comparative thing is really helpful for kind of mutually constraining thinking about what can be said from particular examples. I guess the other thing for me is that history has become really important. It's just, I suppose I find, you know, like research really overwhelming, because if you're following the questions and the problems, then sometimes it doesn't know particular disciplinary boundaries, and you know, it's important to cut across them. Yeah, so that you get in all kinds of trouble doing that. So I think that's important for me about theory. And then I guess I'm quite interested in the history of ideas, or something more agonistic, like a genealogy of ideas, you know, a bit more Foucauldian. So that's kind of, I'm always quite interested in how the problematics change over time, and how the kind of theoretical apparatuses that people have brought to bear on those problems have changed over time and through contestation, you know. So yeah, in terms of how I design the studies, well, I've quite a particular trajectory that I don't think bears much repetition in a way, which is that my PhD was with people who hear voices and sort of psychiatric survivordom broadly, a sociology PhD in the UK. And then I moved to the US and just happened, basically, there's a bit more to it than this, but basically happened to start working on a psychedelic research trial because I thought it was super interesting, and I had access to it. And it was the sort of earlier days when they just looked for any labor that people were happy to kind of offer. And it was only in the middle of that research, with doing qualitative research for a trial, doing interviews with participants who'd been on the trial, that I realized that there was loads of overlap and lots of really interesting things to explore at these intersections of these psychedelic experiences that are putatively, or that seem to be therapeutic on the one hand, and the kind of ways of making meaning out of experiences that get pathologized that I studied during my PhD on the other. And so at that point, that was around 2015, and I've still been working on the same project since then, you know. But at that point, that was then kind of for me just a set of imperatives to dive into the history of the psychotomimetic theory, the reasons why people understand it in this space, but in the psychedelic space, understand it not to be applicable anymore. And then all the edges, you know, the edges that including the kind of corridors of the conferences that would go on for me in a pre-COVID era, and maybe chat forums and people with small megaphones who would be talking about either the dark side of psychedelics, or just how psychedelics were helpful for them in their experiences of quote unquote madness, and all these kinds of exceptions to what is the emerging orthodox sort of statements about who psychedelic therapy is useful for, who it's not useful for, and contraindicated for. And so bringing those all together has been, you know, and with the history, and then with some of the kind of theories behind this, it's just been one massive project, really. So not a lot of repetition, but just like one ongoing beast of a thing that I can't wait to be done with, in a way.
Another thing I really appreciate about your work is that there's this kind of subtle, imminent critique of this new psychedelic renaissance. And even today, you know, pulling apart some of these doxic notions of trust in the therapeutic relationship. And I'm wondering, what kind of motivates the criticism? Is it the lack of collective? Is it a lack of politics that is apparent in the kind of corporatized psychedelic space that's rapidly expanding?
Yeah. Yeah. It might be, I mean, it's probably most honest for me to say that it's a kind of natural tendency of mine. You know, I trained in kind of critical theory, and, you know, so this kind of approach to understanding social phenomena through political economy, for example, that's deep in me, you know. And having kind of suspicion towards certain kind of capitalist logics and how they kind of take up and really accelerate certain things. But there's also been a lot of critique within the quote unquote field, right, about medicalization, commercialization, mainstreaming of psychedelic therapy. I feel like I come at that with a slight advantage over many people who have kind of come up through the sort of psychedelic renaissance, in that I have a familiarity with the kind of history of psychiatry and previous kind of eras of magic bullets and, you know, the hype and so on. And so that is something that I try and remain really attentive to, how there's a certain recapitulating of dynamics right now with psychedelic therapy, despite all the ways in which it does seem to be quite singular. So the critique is in part motivated by a desire to kind of to amplify some of those voices. And I think I had a bit of anticipation, and I'd love to hear your perspectives on this. But I was amongst a group of people, academics, but also mainly just people in the sort of psychedelic space, who were anticipating an avalanche of positive messaging and, you know, the new magic bullets kind of mainstreaming a few years prior to sort of Michael Pollan's big book, which really kind of led to all of this kind of which is key in a lot of this exploding. And so I feel a bit lucky in that respect, because it meant I've got a little bit of like a head start, you know, in kind of thinking through some of these dynamics and writing some stuff. So that's been where I felt myself to kind of be able to be of most service, you know. I don't think anybody needs to be kind of amplifying the pharma-esque or actual pharma claims of, you know, what psychedelics can do, but rather it's about thinking a bit more critically. I mean, I guess sorry if I'm going on a bit, but there's just one other thing, which is that I have, since my PhD and before, had a real commitment to what could get called sort of mad pride or psychiatric survivor politics. And so for me, in the psychedelic space that I've been in since about 2013, there's been a big critique of how psychedelic exceptionalism will end up kind of, I don't know if you guys say it, we don't say it here, but the Americans, as they say, throw other drug users under the bus, you know, in this kind of exceptionalizing of psychedelics. And I've always been interested in how the psychedelic experience today has the possibility to throw a whole load of other, you know, the inconvenient or the inappropriate experiences back under the bus, to re-pathologize them in order to scoop off a certain bunch and say, but these are actually mystical and wonderful and therapeutic. Whereas that's not what, that does not seem to be the case in the sort of broad survival movement. So that's important to me.
Thank you.
I think there's one question, actually, Kevin. I don't know if you can, Janice would like to ask a question.
I can only see that Janice put a note in the Q&A. Maybe try typing it again, Janice, and I'll look for it. Agnieszka, do you have a question in the meantime?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Janice, that I went on with that. If I'd seen that you'd said you have to leave, I would have stopped. Sorry about that.
I wonder if it's possible to give vision to Janice, like video, or she has to type it.
I've just been unmuted. Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Super, super. Thanks. This was a fabulous talk, Tehseen. I really found it fascinating, and I'm very interested in your work, and I'm sorry I wasn't even familiar with it before today. So thanks, Aga, for asking me to attend. Let me ask you sort of, I know that I totally get your concern around sort of the psychedelic pharma-esque and what the testimonies of people that are in the clinical trials can be, how they can be used and abused and used to, sort of do this. I'm wondering though, if you're noticing any differences, like, sort of following a sort of political economy line in the sorts of testimonies that you're getting, with the sorts of experiences that people are telling you. And I mean, it is very real. I mean, many of us have been duped in the past by, collecting very kind of intensive ethnographic research that then is subsequently used by pharma to sell a product that we know doesn't really work really well, or it works in a very different manner than the way in which they're marketing it, right? And so I'm wondering how much control you have over your research, how much you're actually able to do the research you want without anybody sort of following you in and saying, okay, these are the people we're going to give you access to. So I guess I'm getting at the sort of ethnographic, the realities of doing ethnographic research with clinical trialists, and whether those clinical trialists' interests close doors for you and your interests.
Yeah. Oh, thanks so much, Janice, for that, and thank you for the kind words. Do you really have to leave like right now? Because
I have 4 minutes. I have a whole other research group that is submitting a grant in the next week, and so it's sort of like I'll take 5 or 6 minutes. So please talk, and let's have this, and I definitely will have to leave in 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Yeah, great questions. The word that came to mind with the second part of your question for me, which is touchy. I haven't written much about it, and it's important for me to kind of address it properly now, is betrayal. Because I did not come on board as someone researching psychedelic therapeutics. I'm sorry, I didn't come on board in the clinical trial, which I came onto at Hopkins, as someone who was researching the researchers. I just came on as someone who was doing qualitative research. But I had a background which was in sociology, a PhD in the UK, which is much more ethnographic than, at least it is in the US. I'm not sure how it is in Canada. But so I had a sort of natural training, to kind of to watch the watchers, to look at knowledge construction as it was happening, where it was happening, and almost like kind of mentally making notes to myself, like, oh, this is fascinating, and how is it all kind of happening? But it was only in the sort of towards the end of my postdoc, which is around 2015, that I realized that I really wanted to kind of get into this topic, which is a kind of a taboo intersection, psychedelics and madness, and understandably, given the kind of mainstreaming kind of narratives. And at that point, I realized that I just felt very much like I was suddenly I'd thrown myself into being a bit undercover, and that if I were to kind of explain fully my intentions with my friends and colleagues and, you know, the people who were my community at the time, I'd moved out to the US for kind of personal reasons. So this was kind of my life for the first few years. Is that they may feel a bit betrayed, like what are you trying to get at here? Why are you bringing these experiences into proximity? It's not good for the bigger agenda, you know. And at the time there was a very loud kind of not yet kind of messaging, you know, like okay, maybe we can talk about this stuff, but not yet, don't derail the train. And in a way, I feel like maybe because of my own inefficiencies or recognition of my own myriad ignorances, it's taken me so long with this project that I feel like now we're in pretty safe waters, actually, maybe, at least in some respects, you know, post-Michael Pollan, post-Big Pharma kind of coming in. So the psychedelic kind of space looks very different than I think it did even like 3 or 4 years ago. But I feel I feel like a sense of like not wanting to betray my interlocutor / friends from before. I still feel that. I have to get in touch with my old boss, who is the head of an extremely kind of important position in the sort of psychedelic space next week, and I don't really know how to do it. So I'm always working with betrayal. I'd love to talk more about that if we could. And then the other thing that I wanted to say is that the research I do, I try and make really leaky. Like I kind of do research that I hope does kind of leak out and propagate. And so sometimes I try and include some kind of hidden, well, it's not very hidden kind of stuff in there. Like in my criticisms of randomized controlled trials around psychedelics, for me, it's shocking that the expectations of participants isn't measured more thoroughly before and after and at different points in their involvement. It's also shocking to me from an ethnographic perspective that participants' support networks are not more fully appraised. You know, like some participants will be going to local psychedelic societies, they'll be looking at stuff online all the time, there'll be so much sociality around the making sense of their experiences. Other participants, especially in the early days, you know, they're quite isolated. And so that seems to me to be really important. So in writing about this kind of stuff, I'm actually hoping that it does kind of leak out to influence kind of clinical trial designs. I mean, you know, I'm trying not to get too messianic about it. And I would love to actually to collaborate again with clinical trial researchers, bringing more of an anthropological perspective to like enrich the study designs. But I guess that hasn't happened yet. And then that comes back to the betrayal thing. So it's a bit convoluted. Thanks for that.
Agnieszka, did you have some questions?
Yeah, I do actually. I have questions about clinical trials. This is right now. I read some of your later pieces, like last pieces, and you were talking about clinical trials and how the discourse of agility, adaptivity was kind of promoted by psychedelic researchers to open more space.
Sorry, what discourse?
Discourse of like agility and flexibility in clinical trials were kind of promoted by psychedelic researchers to kind of open more space. And actually what's going on right now in Canada, there's a modernization of clinical trial framework being proposed, and there are consultations. And one of those, and the flexibility is very much embedded. But also there is a proposal for decentralizing clinical trials and allowing for electronic data collection, for example, and electronic consent. And I know that you've written just recently about this digital psychedelia. So I was wondering if you can if you can comment about like what do you see like the dangers and possibilities, because you said in your recent piece about digital psychedelia that we kind of have to adopt approach of harm reduction in a way. It's going on like this digitalization, but we have to kind of like develop maybe more socially respectful way of dealing with it. So I was just thinking if you have any thoughts about that.
Thanks so much. Such big questions, you know. I'm like, I'm so much better at conversation, you know. So I wish, you know, I don't know if we can turn this into that, but
Sure.
I'm sorry if I missed the mark a little bit in responding, and, you know, it'd be lovely to keep the conversation going. But yeah, so big, just to kind of maybe get us going, or to riff off of you. Yeah, the clinical trial designs and flexibility, inflexibility. I mean, there's so many concerns with that, and it's really interesting to think about how that might change, could change. It was in Danielle Giffort's book from last year that I remember reading about, that I remember first kind of thinking a bit more about how the kind of whole, the whole kind of culture of thinking around clinical trials has shifted over the decades to kind of really emphasize the virtue of flexibility. So I'd love to hear more about what's going on in Canada, but in terms of decentralizing, I mean, that I imagine, at least in part, as kind of being able to increase access and also reduce cost potentially. What I'm quite interested in at the moment is what comes under this language of post-marketing surveillance or pharmacovigilance, you know, partially because oh, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's so hard to do the multiple. Yeah, so with pharmacovigilance, I'm interested in that because of, in part because of the ways in which psychedelics are so sensitive to kind of context and so on, you know, and so even like I remember learning once, and perhaps you'll know this stuff better than me, but the biggest marker, I think I remember learning during a postdoc, my postdoc, the biggest marker of whether someone will will use illegal drugs as if they already use other illegal drugs. Like legality, illegality matters a lot, you know, in people's kind of assessments of whether they would do something or not, and whether they do something or not. And so as psychedelics get approved, I think about all the ways in which that will change people's understandings of what they do and their power and their efficacy, and, you know, the fact that they've been sanctioned in this kind of state form. And so looking at how that will have knock-on effects on their very efficacy and safety is super interesting to me. And yet, from what I understand, the pre-approval and post-approval systems for assessing safety and efficacy are really not very connected together. And most of my understanding of the kind of pharmacovigilance literature comes from, I just recently read David Healy's new book, which I thought was really good, Shipwreck of the Singular. But in that, the way in which he talks about all these different aspects of post-marketing surveillance that fail, the ways in which the regulators don't have any teeth, the ways in which there's a kind of neoliberal a kind of passing on of the responsibility to report adverse effects to consumers, you know, who in prescriber systems are the doctors, and then when those, as I understood, at least from what he was writing about, when those are sent through to the regulators, they need to be anonymized, and so then legally they can only have the status of anecdote. You know, you can't cross-examine some anonymized data, you know, so all these ways, and then there's massive underreporting as a result of it kind of being, you know, on the onus of the doctors or the prescribers to kind of report it back. So all these ways in which that system is a kind of a bit of a mess, and it would be for me, it's a massive missed opportunity to be able to look at a drug from clinical trials through to it being a kind of established, accessible substance within, or medication within society, and to try and actually understand something about expectation effects themselves across that life course. That to me is kind of really interesting, as, you know, someone interested in the kind of social life of drugs. So then with digitalizing I mean, I'd love to hear more about what exactly what exactly is it that's being proposed in Canada, but in terms of data breaches, all that stuff kind of comes in. No server is ever 100% secure. There'll always be data breaches and so on. Yeah, and then there's just the monopolizing of data as well. Like perhaps I'd love to hear from you about this, but the way, as far as I understand it, this is proprietary data, these data banks that it's interesting to think in relation to clinical trials. But to be honest, I feel like obviously that will always play a role, and there's a kind of sovereign power at play there. But increasingly, these apps and devices that are being produced in the corporate sector are gathering massive databases of extremely noisy data. So it's kind of massive, but you also need it to be massive in order to parse out all the different variables and try and make some kind of sense out of it. But if the sense that you're making out of it is algorithmic, it's kind of opaque in a way, like you can show a correlation. That's something else that I'm quite interested in. I don't know, do you look at that, the way in which increasingly drug sponsors and pharmaceutical companies can demonstrate efficacy algorithmically? That to me is really interesting, but I wonder if there'll always be some opacities, kind of woven into that. Not like there aren't opacities in the current kind of clinical trial approval system, but it's different. It's algorithmic here. And so, so for me, for me, that opens up a big can of worms about kind of snake oil and, who can use their algorithms to opaquely claim what. The harm reduction thing that you mentioned, for me, I think harm reduction is wonderful and expansive as a kind of ethos. And so I was quite interested in that digital psychedelia piece about how the kind of paranoia and concerns, sort of legitimate paranoia, I think, and concerns about big data surveillance and so on, can actually find some kind of analog in the ways in which people engage and have sustained relationships with plant allies and the sort of the entities that emerge through psychedelic use, prolonged psychedelic use. And if there is any kind of analogy there, then ways in which harm reduction in one set of practices might inform harm reduction in the other. It's a kind of a speculative claim, but I think it's super interesting to think about. In that sense, I feel like, just looping back around to what I do, I feel like the most valuable work that I'm increasingly coming to think that I can do as a researcher in the kind of social sciences, humanities, is to kind of make the case and make the bridges for distinct communities that may not normally talk, to be able to talk with one another, so it's a more facilitating kind of work. Like I'm not a fan of the kind of grand theorist who kind of lays it all out, but rather kind of clearing the way for conversations that wouldn't normally happen, which I guess is in a way what I'm trying to do with the sort of psychedelics and madness kind of stuff as well. But sorry, I went all around the houses, but I was wondering about a few things that I don't know if you wanted to talk about. Or...
I think the clinical trial framework is still being developed. They're not very specific. So we are following it. I think it's going to be the second, after the consultation, there's going to be another public consultation. So I will see how Health Canada develops further, because we kind of submitted some kind of comments from our team. Yeah. So we can talk. And I know that Janice, who's my supervisor, by the way,
nice.
She would like to continue conversation, but maybe I just pass for now to Kevin, maybe, if Kevin has more questions.
Yeah, another thing that struck me about the inquiry today was the kind of space of therapeutic psychedelics. It's this room, right? It's and that's where these things that you talked about, trust and the relationship, that's where it happens. I'm wondering if you have done research with any other psychedelic groups that have a totally different space in mind. I would always have a different kind of space in mind too, and whether there's any like conversations between those groups, whether maybe some of the more underground groups are like, try a forest,
Yeah. Yeah.
and whether there's any real flexibility or openness there to think about any other kinds of set and setting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's good. Well, do you mind if I ask you what was the other space that you had in mind, or what was it that you had in mind?
Well, I've been thinking about the relationship between things like recreational psychedelic use and city planning, parks, city spaces, because I think the therapeutic developments are good and important, but there's a lot more to psychedelics too. There has always been, and there will be, but not everyone has access to certain places in the city. Some people don't feel safe from the police or from other groups in certain parts of the city. And so I've been thinking about like how to create safe psychedelic spaces in cities. But I know that you've studied some other groups that, you know, are doing other work with psychedelics, but in other kinds of spaces. So I'm wondering if you ever found them talking to the therapeutic groups, the groups interested in that kind of, you know, traditional couch, blindfold, nice lamps kind of space.
Yeah. No, thank you for elaborating a bit. Yeah, it's funny to call that traditional, isn't it? But it is a tradition now of its own. It's like a kind of, that's to some extent emerged from the kind of 50s and 60s use in the 1950s and 60s, but it's also kind of taken on a life of its own. Yeah, I don't actually, I would say that my focus of my research has been on the clinical trials. And so I've been kind of interested in those questions of set and setting, largely insofar as they pertain to those clinical rooms, those spaces, you know, that we've probably all seen images of and stuff. And actually maybe like kind of disrupting the idea that, you know, a safe and comfortable living room in that context is really a safe and comfortable living room for all the participants, you know, or whether some feel quite alienated coming into that space, or also like the way in which the set and setting is so much bigger than that room. You know, it may be like kind of culturally, politically, so on. It may be knowing that you're doing a legal or at least a substance that isn't illegal within the constraints or the confines of doing it in that room with that kind of research team and so on. So yeah, so I've been kind of that's definitely been my focus. I suppose one thing that I would love to do more of a kind of comparative look at space making, you know, like that. I kind of more anecdotally, I've been in like, the festival context, in kind of group retreat context, not much, but a little bit. And I find it extremely interesting to think about like comparisons and stuff, and also kind of recreational tripping, but I haven't done any kind of proper research on that. It brings to mind what you mentioned, brings to mind Erica Dick's nice, like well, not a few people, but she's written about the kind of hospital inspiring of new hospital designs, right? From the use of LSD and thinking about, well, what kind of hospital would I want to be in, or what kind of space would I want to be in? And I've definitely, I've like heard nice stories, and to some extent, like I'm slightly familiar with ways in which one can design like this kind of the conversation that one can have between tripping or having being in a psychedelic experience, and then designing a space to kind of further optimize having that psychedelic experience. So maybe kind of, I'm thinking about kind of collective artwork or installation work, which might be kind of commandeering in a way, or transforming, let's say, a whole building, or even a whole hotel, a small hotel for a weekend, and then people pay to come, and then you can kind of go through like this kind of amazing, wonderful installation in every room, and how those come to kind of be designed. I guess another interesting thing that brings to mind is kind of this sort of Silicon Valley, like, you know, kind of this kind of imperative to be creative, and the kind of the jelly beans and bean bags at Google kind of space, you know, and how one can incorporate either macro dosing or has become more kind of infamous or popular micro dosing into those contexts. Yeah, well, the one thing that has been a kind of critique of the scientific use and the kind of individual on the couch thing has been the suggestion that group therapy would be far more powerful. And what's been really nice has been to see a little bit of kind of group therapy being incorporated into the clinical trials. For me, I'm thinking about Brian Anderson's work at UC San Francisco. I'm not sure who the PI of that was, but I don't know if it was Brian. But yeah, for me, I find that I'd love to learn more about that. I don't know if you know more about this, but it's super interesting and hard and interesting challenge to think about how to document and sort of measure, if you like, therapeutic dynamics and also therapeutic effect in those contexts, you know. Especially when you have people who have different levels of familiarity with psychedelic substances and experiences, and they're all talking, you know, as you would want in a kind of in a kind of a supportive container. Within that, I don't know how one would measure there's kind of, you know, so many kind of interactions as part of the kind of therapeutic mechanism by which someone changes or comes to experience healing. Yeah, I don't know what I actually you're making me think that I really should go and look at those clinical trial write-ups, and like it's with AIDS survivors, and it's about grief from having lost loved ones back in the 90s and 80s and 90s. So yeah, I wonder how they measured kind of, I mean, I think their people were tripping individually, and then their pre-sessions and their post-sessions were done kind of together as a group. Yeah. Okay. But I guess that's back to therapeutics, and you were actually really pushing it quite far out into kind of, well, I mean, you know, lots of different ways to use psychedelics. Yeah.
Yeah, or just are the groups doing the therapeutic work, are the corporations interested in learning from the recreational underground that maybe has different spaces, different practices, different ideas, mystery traditions and things in mind?
Yeah, I feel a certain sadness about that, because I suspect that no, it's been locked in now. There was kind of a period, right? And it was super interesting to follow certain key figures like Bill Richards, who I talked about a bit in my talk. He, as a bridge between the so-called first wave of scientific research and today, based at Hopkins, I think he's been singularly influential in the shaping of these clinical trials, at least in North America and the UK. The design of the rooms, the kind of protocols, these things like trust, be open, let go, you know, which I don't know was his, but I think it kind of was something that he brought forward. So I think there was a time when it was super interesting thinking that, oh, wow, he's had this inordinate impact, and he brings, I mean, he was a kind of theology undergrad, and he's much more kind of theological in terms of how his approach to this stuff. So that was a sort of super interesting, but I feel like now it's kind of like the formula is a bit locked in, and then if you deviate too much from it, you can't produce comparable data, so you're kind of, you know, constrained by your own previous actions as in terms of earlier phase clinical trials and so on. That's my sense. I don't know if you would agree, or if you...
Yeah, I don't study it as closely as both of you do, but yeah, that's a good way of putting it, is it seems kind of locked in now, which has implications for the clinical trials, but also just the experience itself.
Yeah.
Agnieszka, did you have another question?
I have last one because we have like 8 minutes, or maybe we have more time, more questions. But so I watched one of your some of the episodes from this the conference that you
oh, cool.
Put forward, like Psychedelics, Madness, and Awakening. And you invited people from mad movements, right? Like who identify through the lens of mad identity. No, what I found interesting that they were mostly talking about there were short entries, so I agree, like they couldn't cover everything, but they were talking about their experiences. However, I was just wondering how they relate to this medicalization of psychedelics, because it's very much diagnostic and diagnostic centered. And so it seems that they were embracing the psychedelic experiences, but I was trying to see how they can reconcile, this kind of disagreement with diagnostics and going into this and being part of it potentially.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people at that kind of conference think that a lot of the kind of diagnostic and classificatory system is just bunk, it's kind of rubbish. And would be much more invested, I think a lot of them would be much more invested in kind of more close-knit experiential accounts of when psychedelics can be useful and when not, and harm reduction measures and sort of scaffolding or support that can be put in place, rather than the use of these kind of diagnostic systems to say, with this diagnosis, psychedelics are useful, with this, they're absolutely contraindicated, and it was quite nice to find some of the, it was wonderful to hear, it felt like a kind of, almost like a justice, to hear some of the testimonies of participants talking about how, despite being explicitly not only contraindicated, but kind of rejected from clinical trials because of their psychiatric history, they found psychedelics to be incredibly powerful healing tools or agents, or how, I don't know, depending on how they would articulate it. So yeah, there were some psychiatrists who were there too, which is always interesting, and from them one gets, and I think this is a common thing, this kind of maybe a much more realist or what's it called, like a kind of a pragmatic approach to the diagnostic system, and sort of saying, well, we use it for billing or whatever, but you just have to kind of give people a label, or and yeah, I agree, it's also kind of a bit like it suffers from a lack of validity and reliability and so forth, but we just have to use it, but we're not that interested in people's diagnoses so much as kind of XYZ, and those XYZ things as well. Like I remember there was a psychiatrist who was talking about kind of ecocide and grief, kind of with that sort of in the context of the Anthropocene. So like that kind of much kind of bigger kind of collective ailments and modes of suffering, whilst even whilst their kind of day job is very much to kind of to give people diagnoses and to work within their diagnostic system. So I'm trying to think whether I don't know if you're thinking about anything in particular in terms of people who were supportive of the diagnostic system, or where that tension really kind of came out. But in general, my recollection is that there was quite a lot of dismissal of it as a kind of as having epistemic authority.
Yeah, because the psychedelics are promoted as available to everybody for any condition, not any condition, but mental health condition. But then it's so exclusive, because if people don't want to submit to the diagnostic system, they will be automatically excluded for medical use of psychedelics, right? So I was like thinking how those movements can have the benefits of like legalized psychedelics, at the same time like navigating this going through those categorization in order to achieve, kind of get this benefits. That was just like my thinking.
Yeah, that's I thank you for that. It's a really interesting point, like the way in which people are kind of forced into the medical system, right, within this kind of medical model, if they want to benefit from psychedelic therapy. Yeah, I think that's the reason why there were very few, I think, people at the conference who are kind of out and out cheerleaders for psychedelic medicalization, while at the same time there were many people who were there who were interested in decriminalization, harm reduction, and so on. And it's for that is for exactly that reason. You know, it's kind of not seeing much in terms of utopian possibilities in I don't know, reforming or focusing entire efforts on like reforming the medical system or something to include psychedelic therapy. Yeah. It was a really good conference in that respect. Like for me, I felt like part of me, I'm only half joking as an academic, but I thought, well, I've been doing this book project for 3 years, and who's going to read it? I mean, maybe some people, but it's a book, and it's whatever, academics, sheesh, like this, And then it was in that context that I met this anthropologist and mad activist advocate, Will Hall, and the three of us kind of started having a conversation, and then it kind of built outwards to a bigger team around doing a conference where we can actually bring these communities together. And that was such a more meaningful kind of labor for me. It was exhausting and really difficult in lots of ways that maybe we don't have time to get into, but it was super instructive for me. But it remains, like, for me, very meaningful compared to kind of writing articles and stuff. I mean, maybe the book will be another thing, but I'm super glad we did it, because it was bringing together fringe communities, who share a lot of overlap, kind of people who are critical of the sort of psychedelic mainstreaming on the one hand, and then people kind of psychiatric survivors with an interest in or understanding of or experience with psychedelics on the other.
Yeah, I just posted a link to the conference if anybody would like
you.
to follow up and get some, because I remember the transcripts are still available. So I'm going to go back anyway. Listen more to it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry, Kevin, I think you're muted.
I'm muted. Yeah, thank you. I think we could keep going, but I know some students got to run to classes. Evan might have to run to another event. But Tehseen, thank you very much for sharing all of your insights and work today, and for bringing us an original work, and it's very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for hosting. It was really lovely and some really thought-provoking questions. Gonna kind of try and integrate into the work. Yeah. Pleasure to meet you both and all.
Good to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and thanks again, Agnieszka. Thanks again, everyone in the audience, for being here and for participating. Okay, well, hope everyone has a good rest of the evening there and day here. Hope everyone takes care and stays safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.